You are listening to Eat Meat Sparingly, a Word of Wisdom podcast. I am your host, Ali Essig. About a year or two after my husband's stroke, I wrote an article for LDS Living magazine explaining my entire situation. I explained his stroke, what happened, and the spiritual epiphany I got when I realized that we needed to follow the word wisdom completely. It was a beautiful article, and I was so thankful that LDS Living published this. And in return, I got lots of positive feedback. So many people reached out, but one letter in particular really stuck out to me. It was from a man who heard my story and told me that basically I was wrong. He said that I needed to follow the ketogenic diet and that the root of my husband's stroke was because of insulin resistance. Now, I agree with a lot of what he said. I think insulin resistance plays a huge role when it comes to increasing your risk of things like cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and stroke. However, there is a no one size fits all, and you do not need to follow the ketogenic diet in order to overcome insulin resistance. In fact, there's a better way, and I'm about to tell you. Before I begin, though, I want to let you know about my dear friend and a terrible situation that she went through recently. She was plant-based already, and she got one of those diagnoses that no mother wants to get. And that was that her daughter has type 1 diabetes. And there were lots of kind people who reached out. And similar to my experience, she did have just one person reach out and say, oh, it's because you're on a plant-based diet. Now, first of all, this is type 1 diabetes, and it's an autoimmune disease. We don't know exactly why this happens, and you can't control all of the factors. Eating a plant-based diet actually, in general, it decreases your risk of this happening to you, but it still can happen. Just like those who eat a plant-based diet can still get cancer and can still have other chronic diseases. But in this situation, I really felt for her because it wasn't just that. It was when she went to the hospital, had all the education on how they were supposed to manage the diabetes with her daughter. Not once did they give her another option besides counting carbs. And I'm here to explain to you that there is a better option for you. You don't have to count carbs to manage your diabetes. In fact, it's even easier if you address this particular thing. And let me go into the details of it. And I hope you don't get lost with how this happens, but we have to understand the difference between type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. So in type 1 diabetes, it is when your pancreas, a normal healthy pancreas creates it has beta cells, which then create insulin. And in someone with type 1 diabetes, their body attacked their own beta cells. So therefore their body no longer produces insulin. They can't at all. And with type 2 diabetes, at first, at least, their body is still able to produce insulin. It's not about the beta cells they haven't been attacked, and they should be in a good place. But the longer you have type 2 diabetes, you can have what's called beta cell suicide. And that is when, again, similar to type 1, you're no longer able to produce insulin. Now, for type 1 and type 2, it's beneficial to follow this way that I'm about to explain of eating because we're addressing the underlying cause that usually makes people more insulin resistant. And even though for type 1 diabetes, the cause was not insulin resistance, treating it in this way can help you become more insulin sensitive and help you have to inject less insulin overall, which is huge. Even though, there's nothing that you can do, you cannot produce more insulin. The fact that you'd be able to inject less insulin over time helps you to understand that this is the better way to help you become more insulin sensitive. Now, I want to go into detail about what happens with type 2 diabetes and why, again, this still works if you have type 1 or even PCOS or even gestational diabetes or even if you're pre-diabetic. It all begins with your insulin receptor. I want you to understand that when it comes to insulin, it's not just insulin. That's the key. It's the key that unlocks the door. So you have the key, insulin, you have the insulin receptor, which is the key lock. And then you open the door and what happens? You have glucose that's in your bloodstream. And when you open the door, as insulin is the key that unlocks the door that lets glucose in, then it's able to come into your cells. Now, you have to understand that fat does not need that invitation. Fat does not need insulin. Fat can bypass that whole system and just walk right into your cell without an invitation. And the problem is when you consume too much fat, either by just overeating even sugar, and your body ends up storing too much fat. So it's the fat you eat or the fat you wear, what can happen is that the lock, like the receptor, gets gummed up. So even though insulin is the key that unlocks the door, if the receptor is gummed up, then the key can't fit in. It doesn't work. And fat is what can get in the way. Now, you can manage diabetes, type 1 and type 2, by determining how much glucose you put in your bloodstream at a time. And that makes sense. And that's what the general overall society looks at managing diabetes or managing insulin resistance, is making sure that you're not overloading your system with glucose. And in that sense, it totally makes sense that you would do that, because if you don't eat a ton of sugar, you don't need a lot of insulin. And if you were to just put on a continuous glucose monitor, you would notice that carb-based things, even beans and potatoes, which actually surprised me, potatoes really do spike your blood sugar a lot more than meat. And if you were to put on that continuous glucose monitor, you would notice that in the morning, your blood sugar spikes a lot higher after you've been fasting. So even if it's just fasting from dinner until breakfast, or if you're fasting for spiritual reasons, that first meal that you eat spikes your blood glucose levels really high. And bread, even if it's whole wheat bread, is still going to spike your blood glucose levels pretty high. But what's fascinating is if you really take the time to pay attention to how much fat you're consuming, and it doesn't matter if it's healthy fat. This is where it gets tricky for those who are following a plant-based diet, because if you do not have a high A1C, if you do not have diabetes, if you don't have insulin resistance, you don't really have to stress about fat. You're just consuming all these healthy foods, and they could be healthy fats. In fact, if you're trying to gain weight, I always encourage people to eat more healthy fats, like more avocados, more walnuts, more nuts, more seeds. But there's a magic number, and I didn't come up with this. In fact, I read all about it from a few doctors. Number one is Dr. Barnard. He talks about this a lot, but also there's a really great book that I highly recommend called Mastering Diabetes. And that is where you can truly understand why and how much fat plays a role when it comes to this. And Mastering Diabetes does a really good job of explaining that there'll be lots of studies that show that those who follow a keto diet versus those who follow maybe a low-fat diet. And the problem is most people don't measure a low-fat diet appropriately. America never went on a low-fat diet. We were told to eat less saturated fat. We were told to follow this, but we never actually brought our average fat in general lower than 30% of our overall calories. That never happened. A low-fat diet that really helps with insulin resistance needs to be 15%. Now, your body needs around 5 to 10% of fat. You need fat to absorb certain vitamins and nutrients that are fat soluble. You need fat to operate, but we don't need an excess of fat. That's not necessary. And if you keep it low to 10, but mostly 15% of your overall calories, they found that for most people, that is about 30 grams of fat. Now, if you're a child, it may need to be lower, but 30 grams of fat a day. You don't need to count calories. You don't need to count anything else, but just make sure that the overall fat that you're eating is about 30 grams. I like to look at it as, okay, every meal, if I am really trying to be more insulin sensitive, I need to make sure that I'm not eating more than 10 grams of fat in each meal. It's interesting because when they did the studies, and the reason why a lot of people don't understand this concept is because we didn't even have the technology. The technology came out at Yale University in 1999 to see exactly what was going on a cellular level inside someone who was insulin resistant. And that's when they found that it was saturated fat in particular that was the fat that was gumming up the lock. That saturated fat was key to not only increasing your risk of diabetes, but we already knew it was increasing your risk of heart disease. But what's interesting is you do have to watch all types of fat. So we know that it is saturated fat that gums up the lock, but all types of fat matter. Again, the fat you eat or the fat you wear. So if someone is diagnosed with diabetes and they decide to go on a low carb diet and in doing so lose weight, and it doesn't matter how you lose weight, it's going to improve your A1C. It's going to improve your insulin sensitivity, even if you're on a Twinkie diet. You know, the study of the man who decided to just eat Twinkies and make sure he was eating below his calories, he lost weight on a Twinkie only diet and he improved his A1C on a Twinkie only diet. So clearly it's not just the sugar or the starch. There is something to do with losing weight. And in so doing, you will improve your insulin sensitivity. You will get better A1C numbers. And so for a lot of people, it's easier for them to go low carb. It's easier for them to count the carbs. But I would like to show you why maybe taking a second and doing this other method is going to be better for you in the long run. First of all, those who are are diagnosed with diabetes have a significantly increased risk of dying, not from diabetes, but from heart disease. Some studies show that you have 4 times higher risk of dying from heart disease if you've been diagnosed with diabetes. And why is that the case? Well, it's because you're following for the typical protocol. And that is that most people, in order to control their diabetes, are following a low carb diet. And when I read this book that this man suggested that I read that promoted a keto diet when it came to insulin resistance and showed how insulin resistance is the culprit of all diseases, including stroke. And while my conclusion of following the word of wisdom and eating meat less sparingly was completely wrong, because I needed to make sure that my blood sugar levels were stable. And in doing so, I need to eat more meat, even though you can actually do a keto on a plant-based diet, but I digress. The studies that were used in this book were short-term studies, and a keto diet or a low carb diet in general looks amazing on short-term studies. And most studies between 3 to 6 months show that a low carb diet reduces your hemoglobin A1C. It can reduce your blood glucose variability. It can reduce your total insulin use. It can even reduce your LDL cholesterol. And of course, it's very effective for short-term weight loss. But here's the thing. If I were to write this man a letter, this is exactly what my letter would outline. When you look at studies that are long-term, that are 6+ months, 5 years down the road, you see a very different story. You see that low carb diets with studies 6+ months long actually increase your heart disease risk. It increases hypertension. It increases your LDL cholesterol. It increases your triglycerides. It increases your risk of heart disease and stroke. It increases the inflammation. It increases your risk of cancer. It increases your kidney failure risk. And for those who have had diabetes for a long time and follow this diet, you know, because you probably have had issues with your kidney. It increases your total body inflammation. And overall, you tend to gain weight over time. Your blood pressure tends to increase, and you have lower energy. You have impaired digestion. I mean, all these digestive issues long term. You're having food cravings. You miss fruit. That's the biggest thing, that when people follow counting their fat grams instead of counting their carbs, they're like, oh my gosh, I can eat fruit and it doesn't spike my blood sugar. This is a miracle. They have missed fruit so much. And it increases your insulin resistance over time. And you can't even tolerate carbohydrates. You eat one bowl of cereal, like Frosted Mini Wheats, and your blood glucose goes sky high through the roof because you have made yourself so insulin resistant, even though your blood sugar levels are staying stable. But again, the insulin can't do its job because that lock is gummed up with so much fat. So you eat a potato, you eat any type of sugary substance, and it's like huge blood sugar spike and you feel terrible. And it increases your risk of fatty liver disease. So I didn't care about short-term solutions. When it came to my husband's stroke, I was like, I am not following anything unless this research is longer than 6 months, unless this research shows that after 5 years. And I'm sorry, but so many people say, you know what, cholesterol doesn't matter. You don't have to worry about it. I'm sorry, but I was not willing to take that risk when it came to my husband's health. And it is a risk. And when you follow these low carb diets long term, it's a risk. So if I were to sit down, if I were to be someone, a nurse who's working in the hospital, and someone came to me, their child was just diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, I would give them 2 options. Not just one, but 2 options, because the truth is you do have 2 options. I do feel like the second option is better, but most people don't even know that there's another option. Option 1, when you're diagnosed, or if you are pre-diabetic, or if you have type 1 or type 2 or PCOS, or if you're pregnant and, you've been told like, okay, you need to go low carb. No, the truth is you have 2 options. Number 1, you can go low carb. You can count your carbs. You can make sure that you're keeping track of everything. You can do exactly what they usually tell you. However, the better option for your long-term health is actually option 2. And that is that you are counting your fat grams. You have to make sure that the amount of fat you're eating, the total fat, cannot be more than 15% of your total calories. Now, this is what throws some people off, because putting this into practice is actually a little bit different than you think. You can't just eat a typical plant-based diet. You actually cannot eat a lot of tofu. Now, it can be difficult. And one of the authors of Mastering Diabetes, Cyrus, he has become a friend of mine. We went on the vegan cruise together, and I want to have him on this podcast in the next couple of weeks to show you exactly how it's done. But in order for him to get his protein, because he's an athlete, if you've ever seen pictures of him, he's like super ripped, super strong. And in order for him to get the amount of protein that he needs, he uses beans. He cannot rely on tofu because tofu just has too much fat. So he eats 3 cans of beans a day. Now his gut is used to that. And I know not everyone can handle it, but I do want to give you a tip. If you cannot handle beans, make sure that you're eating seaweed or even any type of green with your beans, because the greens have the enzyme that some beans are missing. And if your body can't handle it, mixing the two together will help you. You can also obviously take Beano, but in general, just mixing greens and beans, and in particular seaweed like nori, just crumble nori over your food, and that can help with digestion. And so you don't get those side effects. But you do have to make sure you're not overdoing it on flax seeds. You have to make sure you're not overdoing it on any type of nuts. Again, 15% of your total calories of fat and nothing more. For most people, that's 30 grams, but just make sure you're not going over 40 grams. Does this work? Well, my friend Melissa had gestational diabetes. She had read the book, Mastering Diabetes. She was following a plant-based diet and she said, okay, I want to do this. I know about it. I want to do this. And she told her doctor, and her doctor thought she was crazy. Like, no, what? You can't just eat potatoes. You can't just eat, like, all these things are going to spike your blood sugar. There's no way. You can't have all the fruit you want. She's like, let me give it a try. So she did. And I helped her through it. She texted me every single day the amount of fat she had that day. She didn't count anything else. She just counted that. I mean, she was pregnant. She was like, I'm just going to eat. I'm going to make sure that I'm keeping my fat within 30 to 40 grams. And she did. And the doctors were floored at the results. She's like, what? You're eating all of that and you're able to keep these blood glucose numbers? This is amazing. It's amazing. It works. I promise you guys, this works. But here's the other question that a lot of people ask. They say, okay, I've read all the books. I know all about insulin resistance. And I've heard that you need to make sure that you're not increasing your blood sugar spikes. And people ask, why is this even important? Why should we even matter? What if I'm a healthy person following a healthy lifestyle? Is this something that I need to worry about? Number one, if you do not have high A1C numbers, if you do not have diabetes, prediabetes, PCOS, gestational diabetes, type 1, type 2, any of this, then you don't necessarily have to count your fat grams. You will want to follow other strategies that I'm about to tell you. But why does this matter? Number one, when you have big sugar surges in your body, I want you to understand it's normal for your body's blood glucose to go up and down. Totally fine, totally normal. There's nothing wrong with that. Every time I eat, my blood sugar goes up, and that's to be expected. Remember, this is just one number of health. It's not all of the metrics of health. But when you eat, what we want to avoid is these big surges. What happens when you have a huge blood sugar surge? It creates oxidative stress, right? And it damages cell walls. It can even damage our DNA. And so it really, in order to reduce your body's workload, when you have this oxidative stress, then your body has to go in and fix it. So you want to make sure that you're managing these surges so you can reduce that amount of workload and fixing this oxidative stress and damage that is causing. The other thing is when you can control and reduce these blood sugar surges, you have better cognition, because elevating these blood sugars and having these surges creates this systematic inflammation, and it impairs our ability to think and function clearly. You often maybe feel like you have brain fog or other issues going on. And if you can minimize blood sugar surges, then you'll be able to improve your brain health overall and reduce your risk of Alzheimer's disease. They say that Alzheimer's disease is type 3 diabetes. And this is why, because the blood vessels in your brain, and this is why after my husband's stroke, I really dove deep into this. The blood vessels in your brain, these arteries are very sensitive to oxidative stress. And when you eat food, 25% of the calories go straight to your brain. So it matters that you're avoiding those blood sugar surges. In fact, I usually know that I've overdone it on sugar if I get a little bit of a headache. Call it the sugar headache, because that's my body saying, whoo, too much. This isn't feeling great. And it can truly impact not only your vascular health in your brain, but also towards your heart. We want to make sure that that endothelial lining around those arteries in our blood vessels, in our and inside our body, are strong. And so all of the blood that flows to your brain, that flows to your heart, it can be susceptible to these surges and create that inflammation. So if you really care about reducing risk of heart disease, reducing your risk of Alzheimer's, then you should try to avoid those surges. How do you do that? Well, if you don't want to count fat, like because you don't really need to, you don't have all these other issues, then eating in a food sequence matters. Eating in a food sequence can really help. And how do you do that? Number one, you'll hear, oh, eat your protein first. That's actually not true. Protein still increases your risk of heart disease. So eating protein first is not the only way. And eating protein still spikes your blood sugar. And so I suggest eating fiber first. So soluble fiber, it can help control blood sugars by absorbing the carbohydrates and sugars in your gut with that gel-like consistency. So it's going to slow down the absorption of your food. So fiber first is key. The first thing you put in your mouth, especially after you've been fasting, should be vegetables. In our program, I like to tell people to preload on vegetables. We're always going to preload on vegetables. Then you can eat your protein, then, your fat. And also keep in mind that even consuming vinegar before your meal is super helpful because vinegar actually slows down that acid slows down the carbohydrate metabolism, allowing more time for glucose absorption. And ideally, it should be consumed in the form of a vinaigrette on top of a salad. Yes, you can take apple cider vinegar shots, but it can also create other issues in your throat or with your teeth. And so I highly suggest just eating a salad with a little bit of a vinaigrette beforehand. And that small little thing that you're doing makes a big difference. And then you've probably heard of this, but exercise. Exercise is huge. I was shocked when I wore a continuous glucose monitor how much exercising before my meals played a role, even more than exercising after. Either one is great. Going for a walk after a meal is fantastic. But if what you did when you woke up, the first thing is spent 10 to 15 minutes just going for a walk, that significantly reduces your blood sugar spike. Resistance training obviously is huge. And the reason why is because your muscles have glucose ready to go. It's called glycogen. It stores glycogen, which is basically glucose ready to fight or flight or whatever you need. And so when it's in your muscles, then you exercise, you use all of that glycogen. So when you're eating in that next meal, immediately your body's like a sponge and it just soaks it up. So instead of getting a big blood sugar surge where your body has to figure out where to store the rest of it, it knows exactly where it needs to go and it goes there fast and it reduces that blood sugar spike. And so even any type of exercise, even just like lifting your heels and lowering them, if you have to sit at a desk all day long. And so if you are more fidgety, if you do calf raises at your desk, that can improve. And what was also fascinating, I was just playing around with this blood glucose monitor and seeing what would happen if I ate cake before my meal versus after my meal. And there was a huge spike, even though it was a healthy cake, it had beans in it, all of that. But that spike was the biggest I ever had. It was ridiculously huge. Then I ate my dinner. Then I had the exact same cake right after my dinner. And it was this tiny little bit of a lift, a little bump instead of this huge spike. So making sure that the first thing you put in your mouth before you have your dinner should not be a cookie or a sweet treat, but you can still have your sweet treats. They're not terrible for you, but make sure you're doing it in order, that you're doing it after your meals and not before, especially if you've been fasting. That's a huge one. But even just doing the dishes right after, instead of sitting and eating, but getting up and doing the dishes and cleaning or dancing with your family, those things are huge. And dressing your carbs. So if you're not worried about your fat intake, then if you do add things like peanut butter on your bread or mashed avocados on your bread and not eating your bread naked, that will help to significantly reduce your blood sugar spike. And we still want to avoid saturated fat. So I do not suggest butter. In fact, the best way to eat your bread, I think, is with a little bit of olive oil and vinegar, balsamic vinegar glaze. I love just glazing my bread and eating it that way. And that's a great way to enjoy your bread without a big spike. And just adding whole fruit to your meals, adding your vegetable, your fruit, even if you don't want to eat in a sequence, make sure that every time you sit down that you're eating a fruit and a vegetable, and you'll see a huge difference. But if you are at a party, if you are out and about and there's really nothing that you can control, I want you to at least drink more water. The more water you drink, if you're having your sweet treat, that will also help to reduce those huge surges. Now, lastly, I want to address something that you probably hear a lot, and that is to have a savory breakfast. Now, yes, it is true. Having a savory breakfast can help reduce your craving for sugar overall in that day. But you have to understand that the type of food you eat matters, even if it's controlling your blood sugar spikes. And this is why it falls in line with eating meat sparingly or not at all. So for example, if for your savory breakfast, you've decided to have bacon, eggs, and sausage, yes, that will keep your blood sugar levels stable. Yes, that will help you feel more full. But the problem is it will increase your risk of cancer and it will increase your risk of heart disease. In particular, when it comes to processed meat is a group 1 carcinogen. So even if it's not increasing your blood sugar spikes, even if it doesn't even relate to having a big surge, it does have what's called heterocyclic amines and polyaromatic hydrocarbons. What are those? They're carcinogens. They are carcinogens that come from smoking your food, from processing your meat, from even, it's the same type of carcinogens that come from cigarette smoke and car exhaust. The problem is we're eating that, and we're eating that every day, day in and day out. And the longer meats are cooked, the higher the concentration. And that's why processed meats are significantly high. But even red meat can be a probable carcinogen. It's more of a group 2A probable carcinogen, according to the World Health Organization. So the type of food you eat matters. And if you think that you're going to be super healthy by following a keto diet and putting bacon over your chicken and managing your blood sugar levels, it's only one measurement of health. It's not the whole picture. And so what you eat matters, making sure that when you're piling your plate, that you're not forgetting those fruits and those veggies, and you're not forgetting to get all those nutrients, those polyphenols, those vitamins that are going to help reduce your risk of chronic disease. Remember that those who have diabetes have a 4 times higher risk of heart disease and dying from a heart attack, and not actually from the effects of diabetes. And that is because they're eating so many of these things that increase your risk, like red meat, like processed meats. Even lunch meats are something that I would completely avoid as part of this. So yes, you can manage everything and you can try your hardest and even eat a perfect diet, but there's one last thing that I need to address. And if you really, really care about your health, if you really care about reducing these blood sugar surges, then you also need to address your stress. Because I was shocked when I found out when I wore my blood sugar monitor, but stress plays a huge role in increasing your blood sugar spikes. Now, if you think about it, like I said before, your muscles, your liver stores glycogen so that you're ready to fight or flight at any moment. And you use that glycogen when you're exercising, when you're going for a walk. But when you feel stressed, say you're just on a stressful work call, your body's like, ooh, stress. All right, let's release this glycogen into the bloodstream. We're going to release it that your muscles and your liver has stored so that you're ready to fight. But on a stressful work call, you're not going to use your muscles. So your blood sugar just increases, but you're not doing anything to pull it back in. And it could be maybe your kids. It could be you're stressed about kid stuff. It could be that you're scrolling social media. That's a huge shocker to me. When I was wearing the continuous glucose monitor, I was scrolling social media and looked at my data and was like, what? They're not huge spikes. These are not surges. This is not the type of surge you're going to get when you eat cake. But I was shocked that my monitor noticed. It was like, what did you do here? Because your blood sugar went up high and higher than if you were doing nothing. And it was just, I was lying down watching social media. Another time, which is fascinating, I was looking at my charts and was like, what in the world? Why at 10 o'clock at night did my blood sugar spike? I finish eating at 8 o'clock at night most nights. So I was like, what happened? Oh yeah, I was doing the dishes and I was mad that my husband had started doing the dishes but hadn't finished it. And so I'm sitting there just angry at him, like so mad and frustrated. I even went and talked to him about it, and it made my blood sugar spike. Fighting with others, right? Being stressed, all of this plays a role. So if you really are focused on improving your health, food isn't the only answer. Obviously, you can focus on making sure you're not consuming too many grams of fat. You can focus on working out, exercising, eating your food in a sequence, making sure you're having fiber first. And another shock, actually, even fiber supplements, even if you just were to down a fiber supplement really quick before your meal, that can also reduce your blood sugar spike. It really does work. And all of these things that we talked about, making sure you're waiting for dessert until the end. But if you're not addressing your stress, then you still will receive the negative consequences that come from not managing your blood sugar levels. So in conclusion, I just want to wrap it up so that you know exactly what to do, what to focus on. So number one, if you are someone who has been diagnosed with type 1, type 2 diabetes, or PCOS, or gestational diabetes, or if you're pre-diabetic, I highly suggest that you focus on how many grams of fat that you're eating and making sure that you're not eating more than 30 grams of fat a day, or 15% of the overall calories in your day. Okay. So that is one of the best ways to manage insulin resistance. And because of that, those who have type 1 diabetes, you'll notice that you're going to inject less insulin by following this way of eating than you would if you were to just count your carbs, which tells you that you're addressing the underlying the underlying cause and not just the symptoms. Like you're dealing with, especially with type 2 diabetes, you're dealing with the fire and not just the smoke. When you're just focusing on eating and counting carbs, you're just worried about the smoke. We're just waving the smoke away, but it's not addressing the fire. And so if we can really focus on that, that's key. It's not necessarily guaranteed to reverse your type 2 diabetes because you may have had type 2 diabetes for so long that it's irreversible, but it can significantly help, and it will help to reduce your blood sugar spikes. Now, for those of you who don't have that diagnosis, who maybe you're not worried about that, it still is important to make sure that you're not over consuming, that you're not over consuming sugar, obviously before a meal, that you're reducing your risk of those big blood sugar surges, because that still does matter. You don't really necessarily have to count your fat grams, but you do want to live a lifestyle where you're exercising regularly, where you're eating enough fruit and vegetables so that you have enough fiber, and you're even adding vinegar to your bread or to your salad. Those things do matter. They do play a role, even just drinking more water. So hopefully everyone has some great takeaways, and know that to me, this was key. That really, honestly, eating meat sparingly has all the answers. Even this one that when I first thought, okay, but won't that increase my risk of diabetes? Weren't we supposed to avoid starch? And the answer is no, you don't have to. In fact, this is the better way. And that's why I truly believe that the Word of Wisdom has all of the truth in it. If you really have your faith and put your faith in it and follow this way of eating, I promise you that you can be healthier if you embody the whole thing, and you will see the benefits of it. All right, I'll see you next week. Thank you for listening to Eat Meat Sparingly, a Word of Wisdom podcast. I'm your host, Ali Essig. And if you need more help and support with transitioning to eating more plants so you can lose weight and feel better, improve your gut health, and just reduce your risk of chronic disease, then make sure to check out my PlantWise membership. That's PlantWhys, because I like to teach the why behind eating more plants. But if all you need is just a couple more delicious recipes that feed your family and everyone loves, and not to mention super simple and easy, then make sure to check out my YouTube channel, which is also PlantWise, PlantWhys. Hope to see you there.